Hey guys, thanks for checking back to New Camera What's Next, episode 3. It's going to be about ISO this episode, and we're going to explain it basically with comparison to sensor size and things like that. Before I get started, I just wanted to make sure that you guys are getting something out of this, and I would love to get some feedback from you. This is not something I'm doing for money, I'm not monetizing it or anything like that. I just thought it'd be kind of cool. We get asked questions all the time about taking pictures while they're on vacation or when they're coming down to visit, and in many different situations. So I just thought it'd be nice to do this for people so that they could actually get to grips with their own camera and have as much fun with their camera as I do with mine. So that's the main reason for it. So to help me with this endeavor, please leave some feedback. Like it if you like it, and if you don't, give me a thumbs down. But if you would give me some feedback, it will help me improve and get better along the way. The one thing I have found out, it's fairly hard to keep these subjects interested, so I'm going to do my best to try and inject a little bit of entertainment with it as we go along. But for now, here we go. It used to be known as ASA, but more recently known as ISO. It's just basically the sensitivity of your sensor. It's a scale that starts normally at around 100, although some cameras can go lower to like 50. I think there's even some that will go to 25, and then an expanded ISO range. And then the upper end is really depending on the camera. There's some that don't go very high at all, maybe to 3200 ISO in some of the cinema cameras. Still cameras typically go a lot higher, but they can go up to hundreds of thousands in the ISO range. The basic rule of thumb with ISO is the lower the number, the better the quality, the less noise there is within the image. Now, noise is digital artifacting. It can be color fringing is more chromatic abrasion, but there can be some specular colors in shadows and highlights. It's basically unwanted color that you don't want within your pictures, and it normally shows in higher ISOs. There's noise in every ISO, but just to a lesser or greater degree. In the higher ISOs, it's just a lot more prominent. You can see a picture like this one here, for example, where you see the sunset, and then there's really dark areas. That would be an example of where you'd start to see high ISO noise and artifacting in the shadows of that area. I bet if we zoomed into that picture, you would see it. So you really want to try and keep the lowest number you possibly can when you're shooting, when you're adjusting your ISO. Now, all cameras pretty much have an auto ISO built into them. You can just, you have to check your camera manual to figure out how to do it. I don't personally use it just because when you're in a really low light situation, it can pick ISOs that you wouldn't normally use, like it'd be too high when you could actually make them a little bit lower. But they are getting better. The A7R2 actually has boundaries, so if you have it on auto ISO, it will actually you can actually put in the camera the upper limit of the ISO and the lower limit so that it doesn't go outside of that. And then if it does that, I have no problem with using it at all. But night times it can tend to overuse the high ISO when there could be other ways to bring it down. So nighttime photography, I still tend to shoot manual ISO, not auto ISO. Okay, what I want you to do is take your camera, put it in the P mode. Pretty much all cameras have a P mode. There's a fully automated mode, which I think on Canons is like a green button. But the P mode lets you pick the ISO. That's the main difference between the fully automatic mode and the P mode. So go into a fairly dimly lit room and select your ISO. Select it to about 200, take a picture, 400, take a picture. Each time you double the number, it needs half the amount of light to come in. So set it to 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and just keep going up. And then review the pictures back and zoom in on different spots, and you're going to see where that noise starts to appear. And there's no right or wrong. Some people can use it for creative effects, but look at your camera and see what you're comfortable with, what you like. At what point does your camera become, where it's like, oh, that's just wrong, it just looks ugly, or it just unsightly. And that's what your camera's limits are going to be. So just go through all the different settings, check the pictures, zoom in on the dark areas, especially the dark areas. And even where you see like a subtle gradient like we've got on these, if you see the blue skies, where you've got a really subtle change of color from top to bottom, you'll see the noise, particularly in these really fine gradients, especially in JPEGs. If you're shooting a JPEG, the compression really works in these single colors, or actually it doesn't work very well in the single colors, and it can leave like a staggered gradient instead of a really smooth one. So look in those areas and see what you're comfortable with your particular camera. Not all cameras have the same amount of noise. The sensor size plays a part towards the amount of noise. The smaller the sensor, typically the more noise there is. Now, if we take the bench standard as a 35mm, you can have a 20 megapixel 35mm sensor, and then you can have a APS-C size sensor, which is probably about half the size, and still be 20 megapixels. So they're the same megapixels, they're just physically different sizes. Now the difference in the sizes is basically, if you've got a 20 megapixel on a bigger sensor, each pixel is actually going to be bigger within that sensor. So therefore it allows more light into the sensor and creates less noise or artifacting. The smaller the sensor, the smaller the size of the pixel. So they're both 20 megapixel sensors, but the smaller APS-C size one, each pixel is smaller, therefore not allowing as much light into each pixel. That's where you get the noise. So smaller sensors are going to create more noise. Your iPhone, your phone would be a classic example. You're putting they're saying they're 12 megapixel sensors, or whatever's yours is 20, but it's actually minute. It's a tiny sensor, and there will be a ton of artifacting on sensors that small. Now they're getting better and better, but basically that's the rule of thumb. You know, the smaller the sensor, the more artifacting you're going to see. So when you're picking your ISO, you can see that the lower the number, the better quality the image, or the less noise or artifacting. So you really want to try and keep your ISO as low as possible. You're going to keep it as, typically outside you're going to be 100 or 200 ISO. If it's a cloudy day, you might go to 200 to 400 ISO. If you're inside and it's fairly well lit, you might be 400 to 800 ISO. If you're under candlelight, you might be at 12,800 ISO. It just depends on the situation that you're in. But typically, once you've got your aperture as wide open as you can on your camera, so that the lens is wide open and your shutter speed is as low as you can hand hold it, then the only thing left to change is your ISO. So this is where it comes in. You're going to change your ISO so you can still get a great exposure, even though you haven't got a great amount of light. As I said earlier, you will see an extended range on the ISO. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using it unless you really have to put something out there straight away, so that, because all it's basically doing is fudging the numbers, and it's telling you you're shooting at a higher ISO, but it's basically underexposing and then just lifting the exposure up. So it's shooting at the highest ISO your camera can go to, but then it's fudging it and making it look brighter. So it's, unless you need something instantly, it's not really advisable to use your extended range. It's sort of a bit of a cheat, really. So I would stay in the camera's recommended settings unless you absolutely have to. Because of the differences sensor size make to ISO performance, if your budget can only afford a smaller sensor, then go for it. Don't let it stop you buying a camera. Just do some research into that particular model and see how it does in low light. And like I said, there's no really, it's difficult for somebody to say, oh, this is good up till X and X, Y, or Z, because it's good till you see it fit as good. I mean, if you don't like that look of, you know, lots of noise, or, you know, or it could be acceptable to you or not acceptable to you. So it's only your opinion that really matters, of what's acceptable and what's not. But definitely look into it before you buy a camera, and it should be an integral part of picking the right camera for you. I hope this basic introduction into ISO has helped you understand it a little bit better. Look out for the next episode where we cover lenses, and then we're going to put all this together to figure out how all these different elements come together to make absolutely stunning pictures. Like and subscribe if you would, and look out for the next video coming out this Friday. Thanks very much, guys.